With several years of global inflation and the looming threat of tyrannical tariffs in the near future, many are finding their pocketbooks have hit a hard time. Perhaps finding a new hobby and escaping into older entertainment can provide some reprieve. Greetings, film connoisseurs. Welcome to the No Flimflam Film Fan channel. Today, we are showcasing a simple, homemade, hard cider recipe. Low on equipment, low on costs, hopefully heavy on flavor, and put together from ingredients you can source right in your very own My Backyard. And much like we did for the Beers and Cheers holiday series, we will be pairing this beverage with a very appropriate film, so stay tuned. People have been fermenting cider from apples for pretty much as long as we've had apples. Written records go back as far as Julius Caesar's notes on Celtic culture during his invasion of their lands. For much of the history of the drink, apples were not nearly as sweet as what you find in groceries today, so fermenting an alcoholic beverage was actually one of the only ways to really get use out of apples. This video will show our first attempt, and while it's very imperfect, I hope you can see how easy it actually is. Since I'm using apples from my yard and not a thoroughly sanitized supermarket, the first step is soaking the apples in salt water to draw out any insects, and then thoroughly rinsing and checking them. All told, I think it took over 4 dozen apples to produce about 4 liters or 1 gallon of juice. Oh, bugs? Did I mention bugs? Yeah, I found a few, but hey, don't worry about it. We've been sharing this space since the dawn of humanity. It's really not a problem. Here's a metaphorical moment for your hard cider for hard times. Apples. The apples on this tree are very, shall we say, organic. The worms, the bugs, the squirrels get to them before they ever seem to have a chance to fully ripen. There was not a single apple on this tree that was store-ready, perfect looking. They all had spots, some completely covered in spots. So what do? You cut away the parts that look bad, you keep the parts that look okay, and in the end, the juice, and I think the cider, gonna be just fine. I don't have a juicer or a press, so I cut up the apples, diced them in my little blender, and then squeezed out the juice through cheesecloth. Did this take a while? Oh, you bet. But my partner was out of town, and I had some great podcasts to catch up on. I wouldn't recommend this method for mass production, but as a one-off, I found the process rather meditative and relaxing. Performing this repetitive task really helped to empty my mind and forget the stressors of life. Also, my dutiful assistant was watching the entire time, so I knew I had to work hard to set an example. After several hours of work, I produced about 4 liters of juice, then heated it on the stove. There is a precise temperature range that is ideal here, but I don't have a thermometer. The goal is to shortly heat enough to kill off any wild yeast. Historically, people may have relied on wild yeast for fermentation, but the results were prone to variation. We don't want strange happenings in the flavor of the final product, so we cook that out and then introduce a specific yeast known to get the results we want. This also may help make the product safer to consume. But we're not boiling the juice. Overheating can dampen the natural flavors. A thermometer would be really helpful here if I had one. Hey, whew. So I spooned off a little bit of the freshly squeezed apple juice and okay. You saw those apples, all right? You saw the spots. You saw how they looked. I didn't add anything. No spices, no sugar, just spooned off a little bit of the juice and had a sip, and it's liquid candy, man. You've never had anything like it. It's just so syrupy, sweet, and just a deep, profound, rich flavor. You would think there was a bag of spices involved, but no, it's just those ugly apples. That's it. I squeezed them with my own hands, and I need another hit, man. I mean, you'll never get anything like that at the supermarket. If you go to an orchard, you can come very, very close, but squeezing them by your own hand, pulling them out of your own yard, it's a rush, man. It's a rush. I gotta go get some more. The instructions on the yeast say it needs to be activated in water before use in fermentation. While the juice was still warm on the stove, I added sugar so that it could dissolve into the mix. Sugar is food for the yeast. Then I let the juice cool down closer to room temperature before adding in the wet yeast. An alternate method, and one I think I'll use going forward, is to dissolve the sugar in warm water and add the yeast to that to allow it to wake up and get hungry before adding it to the juice. Once everything was combined, I poured into the demijohn, which is a brewer's word for jug, and put in a stopper with an airlock. It's important to put some clean water in the airlock, both to prevent anything from entering the jug and to show occasional bursts of gas bubbles that let you know the fermentation process is working. It takes 1 to 2 weeks to ferment, and during this process you want the jug, or demijohn, to be kept in a cool, dry place. As you can see, I kept mine at the bottom of my local pyramid. If you don't have a pyramid, any part of the house away from sunlight that stays cool is fine. You can see sediment developing at the bottom as the yeast consumes the sugar and eventually dies off. After about 2 weeks, I carefully transferred to a new demijohn, using a filtered funnel to avoid transferring the sediment. Then I let it age in my pyramid for about 1 month. The airlock is no longer required at this stage. After aging, the next step is bottling. I read that historically people would put a raisin in the bottom of the bottle, but I used a spot of honey. This is because the carbonation that naturally occurs during fermentation flattens during aging. Whatever yeast are still floating around get a little bit of sugar in the bottle, and the reaction produces the final bit of carbonation we need for a pleasantly bubbly end product. I left the bottles here by the dried corpse of my dear king for 5 days. Then they were ready to serve and store in the fridge. And now, as I pour the first glass and commune with the spirits of ancient Celtic homebrewers, I am overcome with the realization that the recipe I followed used half the amount of sugar and yeast I actually needed for the size of my batch. If my mood is to be altered, it will change much sooner by the sweetness of the beverage rather than the alcohol. And that will be just fine. crisp, refreshing, maintains the rich flavor profile of the fresh squeezed apple juice. And all it really took was some spare change and a little bit of patience. Wow, this was worth the effort. I'm very pleased with it. And the only question now is, what movie do I watch while I enjoy this? 辛い時にかけるシードルを飲みながらどんな映画を見るべきでしょう。まずシードルといえば伝統のあるものでしょう。ということは古い。そしてまずいリンゴでもお酒作れるのですね。ということは辛い時にも笑うことできる。最後何よりも甘い。甘いってハッピーエンディングでしょう。Eagle-eyed viewers have probably already guessed from the hints we've dropped. It's going to be an old film, one starring a Hollywood icon with a very alliterative name. You get that? You get that? Huh? Yes, Doris Day and her 1963 romantic comedy co-starring James Garner, Move Over, Darling. The story of how and why I came to choose this film is very true to the theme of finding fun in the midst of hard times. Despite having hurricane-force winds and hurricane-force shape, I guess, this can't be called a hurricane because hurricanes don't occur in my part of the world, obviously. No, this is a bomb cyclone, a name I am not making up, but don't ask me why it's not a hurricane. But I'm fine, don't worry. Power was out for a day, and then internet was out for another day. And that's the real hard times right there. No on-demand entertainment. I had to rely on local cable television for an entire afternoon. For you younger viewers out there that don't understand, let me explain. Television means no choice in what is shown, no choice when it is shown, and no choice when it starts. While that may sound bad, it also means that sometimes you get a fun surprise. So while I did get exposed to a fun old movie I wouldn't otherwise have known about, I also had to piece together the first hour of the movie from clues parceled out to me after my late arrival to the story. And when I turned on the television, well, this is what I saw. I did not know anything about this movie, but after that introduction, I was in for the ride. Why is James Garner having day terrors about Doris Day and Trampoline Tarzan? Is she his wife? I mean, makes sense if she is, because they're the two leads and, frankly, both wonderfully charming performers. But what about this other woman? I just saw her chatting with a therapist, talking about her marriage, and she mentioned James Garner's character. Is she his wife? Are they both his wife? How does that work? Seems like fear about getting cheated on is a driving force behind people's behavior in this. And hey, who can blame them? Famed sexual dynamo Don Knotts is in this flick.
And then there's your tropical crocodile, which is found in Rhodesia and parts of North America, but they really make quite inferior footwear.
Are you free for lunch?
everyone should be worried.
Sexy.
The crocodiles themselves have no talent for making footwear.
Sexy.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to break it up like this. I've just realized I've been reviewing this whole thing. It's wrong. It's wrong. I'm not doing this right. This is a Doris Day movie. Just give me a moment. Whew, that's better. Almost made a terrible mistake. Oh, goodness. In addition to being a jolly romp of a screwball comedy, Move Over Darling is an historical relic of the kind of stories Hollywood used to tell about relationships before no-fault divorce. In this time period, if a marriage fizzled out and the couple were no longer in love, they couldn't just amicably, mutually petition for a divorce. One party had to be at fault, and the party bringing the suit for divorce had to explain to the court how the party at fault had a behavior pattern that fell into a categorical statutory list of the grounds for divorce. Simply put, one person had to be wrong. The possible legal grounds for divorce varied by state, but typically included such things as adultery or disappearing on a tropical island for 5 years and being presumed dead and or adulterous. California, where this film takes place, was the first state to allow a marriage to end without all the blame and finger-pointing. But that didn't happen until 1969, about half a decade after the release of Move Over Darling. If you've watched a few older films about couples having a fight or even couples after a divorce, you might notice they always end in reconciliation. Yeah, Hollywood loves a happy ending more than a complex one. But knowing the legal and cultural environment of the time period of these films, you can see how screenwriters would prefer to write a story about marriage as a bendable, but not breakable institution. The trick for a film like Move Over Darling is that in the midst of all the comedy of errors and the slapstick, in the bulk of the film where the couple just cannot get along and it's so outlandish and so fun and so silly, there still has to be an underlying element of charisma and a bond between the fighting couple, so that when you get to the reconciliation at the end, it's not abrupt, it's not a surprise. Of course they get back together, but should they? That's the question on the mind of audiences. And if we get to the happy ending and audiences are a little put off by it, well, that's a bad sign. But if audiences are just relieved to see, yes, these two charismatic people who clearly were into each other but just missed something, finally figured out how to make it work, you've done your job as a screenwriter. Doris Day and James Garner at their best are two of the most charismatic people you will ever see on screen. And in real life, they were good friends, supportive of each other to the very end of their lives. Knowing that makes it really hard for me not to like the film. They're just so charismatic, and I want them to work well together and be smiling at the end. They're so good at smiling. So yeah, of course I like the film. But my question to you, viewers, for those of you who aren't maybe very familiar with Doris Day or James Garner, maybe you're not that into old movies, what do you think? Look up Move Over Darling. You can probably find it for free online. I won't tell you where, but you can find it. Watch it and let me know your thoughts. Do they deserve to be together at the end, or are they better off alone? So your homework for getting through hard times, at least for a while, is picking up a new hobby like homebrewing, watching Move Over, Darling, subscribing to this channel if you haven't already. It really helps. And commenting with your thoughts on the film. I promise there are no wrong answers except those that I disagree with.